Hey everyone! Today we will be looking into the lives of various courtesans who ended up in poverty, from Renaissance Venice, where a poetess fell from grace, to a Parisian beauty who inspired many works of art. These women lived in splendor, loved dangerously, and met their ends in heartbreaking ruin. So, join me as we explore all of this and much more. For our first tale, we are going back to 16th century Venice. Veronica Franco was born into the cittadini class in 16th century Venice, most likely in 1546. It was the height of Venetian Renaissance culture, the age of Titian, the city's greatest painter, and the last master of the Renaissance style in Europe. Franco's family moved in the kinds of court circles where Titian and others were celebrated. The cittadini were the upper middle class of the city, who provided bureaucrats and magistrates for the Republic's complex bureaucracy. Franco's mother was a courtesan named Paola Fracassa. The cortigiana onezza, meaning an honoured courtesan, were effectively prostitutes, but highly cultured women whose clients were generally few in number, and in the case of late Renaissance Venice, were politicians, magistrates, and prosperous merchants. Many of these honoured courtesans could, for instance, play musical instruments, were literate and well-read, and could discuss poetry, literature, and art with their customers. They stood in direct contrast to other prostitutes who plied their trade near the Rialto Bridge in Venice and had a less discerning clientele. The position of an honoured courtesan was not an unusual one, and there were many courtesans at the royal courts of Europe's monarchies and around the government centres of city-states like Venice, Milan and Florence throughout the early modern period. Veronica learned the skills of an honoured courtesan from her mother when she was still just a teenager. However, she briefly experimented with marriage, and in the early 1560s, when she was still no more than 16 or 17 years of age, she married Paolo Panizza, a doctor in the city. This was an arranged union, one which Franco evidently did not take well to. As a result, she composed her first will in 1564, when she was still shy of her 20th year. Franco included a statement requesting Panizza to return her dowry. Franco would never remarry, though we know that she bore at least 6 children. However, only 3 of these survived beyond infancy. Thanks to her good reputation, as well as her links with many wealthy men in the city, Franco was able to afford to raise her children in good circumstances in her own household, and could even afford servants to help her. During the 1560s and 1570s, Franco rose through the ranks of Venice's notable honoured courtesans. It seems crude today, but in 16th century Venice, courtesans such as Franco were listed in catalogues, which described them and their traits for the many merchants and officials who visited the city. Already in 1565, shortly after her marriage ended, she was listed in the catalogue of all the principal and most honoured courtesans of Venice. This provided addresses and fees for courtesans like Franco in the city. Such catalogues were practical in a city which is believed to have been home to no fewer than 11,000 prostitutes and courtesans during the 16th century. Evidently, Franco was one of the most celebrated courtesans of her day by the late 1560s. When she set about composing a new will in 1570, the individuals who were listed as the executors thereof were from amongst the elite of Venetian society. For instance, one of these was Lorenzo Morosini, a member of the Venetian Council of Ten, which, along with the Doge, Venice's chief magistrate, effectively ran the merchant republic. Another was Ludovico Ramberti, a member of one of the most powerful merchant families of Venice. It seems likely that Ramberti was a prominent client of Franco's, as his own will, which he too had drawn up in 1570, generously bequeathed a house and some land near Venice to one of Veronica's children. Thus, while there is often a frustrating lack of detail about Franco's life, what the will of 1570 highlights was that as an honoured courtesan in her mid-20s, she was moving in circles of Venice's most powerful people and families, and that she was making enough money to establish herself as a lady of a prominent household herself in the city of St. Mark. In 1574, Franco briefly acquired her most famous client. In May of that year, King Charles IX of France died. He was succeeded by his brother, Henry, as Henry III. However, Henry was far away from his homeland, having been made King of Poland and Lithuania in Eastern Europe just months earlier. A long journey home thus ensued, during which he dropped by Venice and engaged in a brief 10-day liaison with none other than Veronica Franco. Years later, in 1580, she would compose a sonnet in which she remarked on her brief affair with the French king. The year after Veronica's brief fling with the French king, the bubonic plague struck much of northern Italy. The feared Black Death had never entirely disappeared after its first arrival in Europe, way back in the 1340s, and it continued to hit regions, with major outbreaks down to the end of the 17th century. Venice was particularly badly struck by the outbreak of 1575, one which lasted till 1578. During it, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the city's population, well over 100,000 people, were killed in the space of 36 months. In an age before effective medicine, quarantine was the only safety from the plague. Many of those who could afford it fled from cities like Venice when there was an outbreak, to avoid the cramped, overcrowded conditions in which disease spread like wildfire. Franco was amongst them, and she spent much of the next 2 years absent from the city, only returning in 1577, by which time the wave of the plague was beginning to subside considerably. When she returned, she discovered that her home was one of the many in the city which had been looted in the course of the epidemic. Through this, she had lost her household silver, jewels, books, and money, a sizable material setback, which equated to years of wages worth of goods for many Venetians at the time. What was doubly curious was that further robberies occurred at her home in the late 1570s, and over time, Franco began to suspect that her own household staff were complicit in these crimes. It was almost certainly owing to her financial setbacks of the mid-1570s that Franco wrote to the Venetian government in 1577, proposing that a new charitable home be established for impoverished former courtesans and prostitutes. She may have been influential in this, as an establishment was founded in the late 1570s, though she was not asked by the government to play any part in administering it. Veronica Franco is revered today as one of the greatest female poets and writers of Europe of the 16th century. Some of this was based on her background as a well-educated courtesan, but it was profoundly augmented in the early 1570s, when she entered the renowned literary salon of Domenico Venier, a scion of the powerful Venier oligarch family of Venice. Such literary salons were a staple of Europe's courts and cities in the early modern period, being something akin to a highly sophisticated book club. Franco became a literary advisor to members of Venier's salon. She also began composing her own extensive poetic work. These usually took the form of capitoli, a form of poem which was popular in the Renaissance world of the Mediterranean, notably in Italy and Spain. In 1575, just before the plague struck the city of St. Mark, Franco published an extensive volume of her own poetry entitled Terze Rime. This consisted of 25 poems, though 8 of these were composed by Marco Venier and another anonymous male author. The 17 poems of the collection, which Franco composed herself, discuss her life as a courtesan. Franco's engagement with her male customers is also dramatized in the capitoli, as the poems in the collection were all addressed to a specific man, each of whom presumably represented a former or current customer. In 1580, Franco published a further work. This was entitled The Familiar Letters, and was a compendium of letters between Veronica and some of her correspondents and lovers over the years. For instance, the first was written to King Henry III of France, with whom, as we have seen, Franco had a brief relationship back in 1574 while he was returning to France to become king there. It is unclear to what extent the familiar letters represents the actual correspondence she had with her male companions over the years, or to what extent these were all literary inventions. The familiar letters were published in 1580, right around the time that Franco was about to disappear from most official records. That year she was accused of witchcraft by her son's tutor, a man called Ridolfo Vanitelli, who claimed Veronica had practiced magical incantations in her home. This was a regular charge brought against courtesans in the early modern period, and Europe was just about to enter into the most brutal phase of the European witch craze, a period of intense witch hunts which saw approximately 40,000 alleged witches executed across the continent between 1580 and 1620. Vanitelli's charges involved a mix of common tropes concerning witchcraft and also slanders about her trade. For instance, in his denunciations, he referred to her as a public prostitute and a witch and a public whore, who invoked the devil and acted as an example for others who persist in wrongdoing. Elsewhere in his depositions, he affirmed that if this witch, this public masked and cheating prostitute, is not punished, many others will begin to do the same things against the Holy Catholic faith. Luckily for Franco, Italy did not have a major tradition of finding witches guilty following accusations, but this didn't mean she was in the clear just yet. Thankfully, with the help of some of her powerful connections, she was acquitted of her alleged crimes. While Franco escaped from the charges brought against her by Vanitelli, these events nevertheless saw her reputation damaged, and the combination of this and the losses of the mid-1570s led to financial and existential difficulties thereafter. All of this was compounded when her literary patron, Domenico Vernier, died in 1582. Thereafter, she largely disappeared from the historical record. She did not publish any further work that we know of, and her tax declaration of 1582 indicates that she was living in a section of Venice where many poverty-stricken former prostitutes spent their last years. When she died in 1591 in her mid-40s, it was the end of a life of one of the foremost female poets and courtesans of the Italian Renaissance. Now, we are going to England, where a humble maid became the mistress of one of the country's most important figures. The woman who would later become one of the most famed beauties of the Romantic era in Britain and Europe was born at Swan Cottage near Neston, in Cheshire, England, on the 26th of April 1765. Her father was Henry Lyon, a blacksmith who sadly died within 7 weeks of Emma's birth. Coming from a relatively impoverished background, a situation which was worsened by her father's untimely death, Emma had no choice but to enter the workforce when she was young. This occurred in her early teens, which was quite a common situation in the early industrial era Britain, before the introduction of universal primary education. By age 12, she was working as a maid, and shortly afterwards moved to London. Various positions followed in the years ahead. It was while in her teenage years that she changed her name to Emma Hart and began a relationship with Charles Greville, a British antiquarian and Member of Parliament between 1774 and 1790. Their relationship lasted for 4 years, during which Emma was also alleged to have worked for the flamboyant showman and quack James Graham. In 1785, Greville ended what had been an extended relationship by sending Emma to his uncle, Sir William Hamilton, who was then serving as a British plenipotentiary at the court of Naples, where she arrived in 1786. Emma would subsequently marry Hamilton in 1791, and as a woman in her mid-20s at the Neapolitan court, she became a hostess. Here she met with many of Europe's leading literary figures, and also became the subject of many portraits, including those by celebrated portrait artists of the day, such as Gavin Hamilton, Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun, and Angelica Kauffman. These depicted Emma in line with classical and mythological portraiture, often portraying figures such as Medea, Ariadne, and Cleopatra, and began to establish her fame throughout Europe. In particular, James Gilray's representation of Emma became well known. However, above being a model solely for artistic work, Emma was able to exploit her talent for imitation and the period's construction of gender to her own advantage. She was, for instance, an excellent hostess who was able to charm men of power. This would play a role in her subsequent relationship with Horatio Nelson. Emma's life at the Neapolitan court between the mid-1780s and the late 1790s was playing out within the context of great political change across Europe. In 1789, a revolution in France overthrew the monarchical government of King Louis XVI. Eventually, in the years that followed, this intensified and led to the execution of Louis by the French revolutionary government in 1793. The French Republic had consequently become a political enemy for virtually all of Europe's great powers, which were immensely troubled by the idea that the revolutionary principles being adopted in France would disrupt their own political situations. Accordingly, shortly after the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789, France would find itself constantly at war with countries such as Austria, Prussia, Russia, and above all, Britain. This was the context in which Horatio Nelson arrived at the Bourbon court of Naples in 1793. Nelson was by that time a leading admiral of the British Royal Navy, one who had held many senior commands in the Mediterranean. He wore his career heavily. He had been blinded in one eye during an engagement near Corsica, shortly before his arrival to Naples. As a highly accomplished leader on these waters, Nelson's task in the autumn of 1793 was to gather reinforcements for the renewed conflict between France and the European powers. This was just an early moment in what became the wider Mediterranean campaign of 1793 to 1796, a long series of naval engagements between the British Royal Navy stationed in the ports of Italy and the French Revolutionary Fleet at Toulon in southern France. In this protracted naval operation hung the result of the battle for control of the Italian peninsula. The mission would also lead to Nelson's encounter with Lady Emma Hamilton. Emma was first introduced to Nelson very shortly after his arrival in southern Italy. This was in her capacity as the wife of the British envoy to the Neapolitan court, Sir William, or Lord Hamilton. Not only was Emma thus married, but Nelson also was, having married Fanny Nisbet in 1787. Fanny was a devoted wife, and while Lord Hamilton would soon come to accept Lady Emma and Nelson's affair, the Admiral's wife never did. An attraction was quickly evident between Lady Hamilton and Admiral Nelson. The Hamiltons invited Nelson to stay at their official residence while he was in Naples, drumming up support for British efforts in the Mediterranean. When he left several days later, a lasting impression had clearly been made by the pair on each other. There the matter might have ended, but 5 years later, Nelson found himself back in Naples. By this time, the French were increasingly ascendant throughout continental Europe, led militarily by a brilliant general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who would subsequently make himself Emperor of France. However, while Bonaparte might have dominated on land, Nelson was the greatest naval commander of the day, a fact which has been solidified with a monumental victory over the French at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798. It was while travelling back across the Mediterranean that he stopped at Naples in late September 1798. Lady Hamilton might well have been shocked by Nelson's changed appearance. He had lost his right arm since his first visit, and was prematurely aged by years at sea. The Hamiltons made him their guest in Naples, and there was soon a full-blown relationship occurring between the 33-year-old Emma and the 40-year-old Admiral. Lord Hamilton, for perhaps many reasons which are not abundantly clear, decided to turn a blind eye to his wife's infidelities with their houseguest. It seems likely that Hamilton was sterile, and guilt at being unable to provide Emma with children may have contributed to his willingness to allow his wife to engage in the affair. By November 1798, news had reached the British newspapers about Nelson's affair in Italy. Henceforth, Lady Emma and her already famous lover would be the subject of sustained media scrutiny in England. Some of their actions simply generated casual interest, but most of British high society was appalled. This obsession with the pair would only become greater in the years ahead, as both they and Lord Hamilton all returned to England. In 1799, a popular revolt occurred in Naples, and eventually would lead to Napoleon imposing a new French royal family there. As these events unfolded, many members of the British Embassy and British community, which had emerged there during the intermittent wars with France of the 1790s, started to make their way back to Britain. When they reached London in November 1800, tensions arose immediately between Nelson, his mistress, and Lord Hamilton on the one side, and Nelson's wife and wider family on the other. The affair was well known of by all involved before their return to Britain, but the actual physical presence of the trio back in England created tensions which now could not be easily ignored. This was compounded when Nelson's wife, Fanny, quickly realised that Lady Emma was pregnant with Nelson's child. Unlike Emma's husband, Lord Hamilton, she would never willingly accept the affair. In an effort to keep the peace, Nelson took up residence with his wife and their family, while the Hamiltons lived separately at a number of London addresses. Yet, when Fanny delivered an ultimatum to Nelson to choose between her or Lady Emma, it pushed his decision. Shortly before returning to active naval duty in 1801, he commenced formal separation proceedings with Fanny, which is a much more unusual thing to do in the early 19th century than it has become in modern times. Moreover, in late January 1801, Nelson and Emma's daughter was born. They named her Horatia. By now, as Nelson was absent abroad on active naval duty, Emma had begun to court English high society in an effort to win over public opinion for her and Nelson's cause. Remarkably, this might have further fueled the London rumour mills, as during one of her social events, the Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, became infatuated with Lady Emma, though nothing resulted from his pursuit of her. That autumn, on Emma's advice, Nelson organised the purchase of Merton Place, a house in Wimbledon where they now lived together openly, Lady Emma, Lord Hamilton, and Admiral Nelson. Following his return to England, when the Treaty of Amiens of March 1802 brought war between Britain and France to an end again briefly. Lord Hamilton died in April 1803, finally dampening some of the criticisms which London society continued to offer against the ménage à trois which they had been living in. But Lady Emma and Admiral Nelson would not be able to enjoy a more conventional marital relationship, as Lord Nelson only outlived Hamilton by 2 years. Nelson, the man who had received so many injuries in the course of his naval career, finally succumbed to one in 1805. Peace between Britain and France only lasted for 1 year, following the Treaty of Amiens. In May 1803, what is usually termed the War of the Third Coalition broke out, with Britain, Russia, Sweden and Austria combining against France and her European satellite states, including Italy and Spain. One of Napoleon's major strategies as a part of this renewed conflict was to attempt an invasion of Britain. But in order to do this, he needed to bring the French navy, which was largely stationed in the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar and north into the English Channel. When this was attempted in 1805, Nelson was set the task of preventing the operation. On the 21st of November, the British Royal Navy, led by Nelson, defeated a joint Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, off the coast of southwestern Spain. No French invasion force could now pass from France to Britain, but Nelson's most glorious victory was his last. He was seriously wounded during the engagement and died just 3 hours later. Emma was distraught when news reached England. She took to bed with grief for several weeks, but in the long run, there was the issue of Nelson's will to be attended to. The British state was determined to exclude Lady Emma as much as possible in the division of the Admiral's estate, and to Nelson's own wishes that his lands and wealth be fairly and evenly divided between Emma and his legitimate family was ignored. Emma received a £2,000 payment, the house at Merton, and a £500 annual payment. But with the cost of maintaining Merton being much greater than this annuity, she was soon in financial trouble. Additionally, the £500 annual payment became the subject of a further legal struggle with Nelson's family. As a consequence, by 1808, she was more than £15,000 in debt, and efforts to sell Merton were unsuccessful. The culmination of the whole episode did not come until 1812, when Lady Hamilton was briefly imprisoned for failing to meet her vast debt repayments. A succession of health problems followed in the years ahead. Eventually, some money was raised by friends, which allowed Lady Emma and her daughter Horatia to escape to Calais in France. Yet, she died here just a year later, at 49 years of age, having increasingly succumbed to alcoholism and obesity in her later life. A tragic end for a woman who had once been famed throughout Europe for the portraits depicting her beauty. Yet, she is well remembered even today, having been the subject of many books, songs and films during the 20th century, most notably the 1973 film Bequest to the Nation, starring Glenda Jackson and Peter Finch, and Susan Sontag's 1992 novel The Volcano Lover, a romance. For our next tale, we are going to early 19th century Ireland. Maria Dolores Eliza Rosanna Gilbert, more famously known as Lola Montez, was born on the 17th of February 1821 in Grange, County Sligo, Ireland. For some reason, Eliza claimed that she was born in Limerick, 1818. Furthermore, this date is established on her gravestone, yet her baptismal certificate proves that her actual place and date of birth was in fact County Sligo in 1821. Her father was Edward Gilbert, a British officer serving in County Cork, and her mother was Eliza Oliver, the daughter of a wealthy Irish politician. Both parents came from fairly good backgrounds. Not much is known about her father's family history, but her mother grew up in her ancestral home called Castle Oliver, located in Limerick. As a baby, Eliza lived with her family in County Roscommon, yet after just 2 years, her father, Edward Gilbert, was stationed in India. First the family travelled to Liverpool, England, and while there, Eliza was baptised at St. Peter's Church. Following this, they departed for India on the 14th of March 1823. After 4 months of travelling, they safely arrived at their destination, a new home, which was thousands of miles away from Britain. However, after only a few months in India, Edward Gilbert unfortunately died of cholera. At the time, Eliza was still only an infant, and her mother, Eliza Oliver, was only 19 years old. Her mother was now left alone to look after her young daughter. Fortunately, her wealth, as well as what she inherited from her late husband, allowed her to have a decent life in India. The following year, she remarried another officer called Patrick Craigie. He grew fond of young Eliza and cared for her. However, he was concerned by her behaviour as she was a spoilt, mischievous little girl. Eventually, Eliza was sent back to Britain to be educated, staying with her stepfather's parents in Montrose, Scotland. This was her first time in formal education, and she instantly stood out among her peers as she had just returned from India, a faraway place her classmates would have only have heard of. Due to the time spent in India, her dress and mannerisms were described as peculiar, especially for a young middle-class girl. This frequently made her an object of curiosity and remark when interacting with new people. Eliza thrived and enjoyed all the attention she was getting from her peers and the local community in general. One teacher later recalled that Eliza was a beautiful young girl, but it was spoiled by her stubbornness. However, with all this attention, her mischievous behaviour only got worse. For example, on one occasion during a church service, she stuck flowers into the wig of an elderly man. Another time, she supposedly ran through the streets naked. Because of this questionable behaviour, she was described as a queer, wayward little Indian girl. It may have been because of this that her mother decided to move her. At 10 years old, she was sent to boarding school in Monk Wearmount, Sunderland. The school was owned by her stepfather's sister and husband, and while there, she continued her education. But it wasn't to last. While at school, she became known for her short temper and outstanding determination. Yet, after only a year, she moved to another school in Camden Place, Bath. The reason behind this was that her parents hoped that this more sophisticated education would turn her into a lady, so she could marry a wealthy gentleman. Only a few years had passed when Eliza's mother attempted to marry her off to a 64-year-old Adjutant General of Bengal. Eliza was only 14 at the time and later described the general as a gouty old rascal of 60 years. Nevertheless, she was a cunning teenager who had her own ideas. In 1837, at age 16, Eliza ran away to Ireland with a captain on leave called Thomas James. They then married in County Meath. Eliza and her new husband soon made their way to India, but she couldn't settle into colonial life, and the marriage eventually collapsed after Thomas James got involved with another woman. She later remarked that runaway matches, like runaway horses, are almost sure to end in a smash-up. After 5 years together in India, the couple separated, and Eliza made her way back to England. While travelling back to Britain, she had an affair with a fellow passenger. Once her husband found out about this, he sued for divorce. With this, a decree was granted that did not allow either party to remarry. Now on her own in London, Eliza took up dancing lessons and decided that she wanted a career on the stage. She reinvented herself as a Spanish dancer under the stage name Lola Montez, making her debut at the Haymarket on the 3rd of June, 1843. In her autobiography, she claimed that her onstage debut was a successful one. However, this was not true. She was recognised as Mrs. James and was booed off stage for being a phony Spanish dancer. Later, a man she had rejected led a protest against her. All this hampered her career in England, so she moved to the continent looking for success. It was around this time that she began accepting favours from certain wealthy men. Word got around, and soon she was seen by many as a courtesan. Eliza, now known as Lola Montez, travelled to Germany. Supposedly, while here, she assaulted a police officer with a horsewhip. Later in life, she always carried a whip and frequently used it. This moment went down as a turning point for this unique characteristic of hers. Furthermore, it was in Germany that she made the acquaintance of the famous Hungarian composer Franz Liszt. The details of their relationship aren't clear, but it's more than likely that they were romantically involved with one another. In any case, thanks to his contacts, Lola Montez was given the chance to debut in Paris as a dancer in Fromental Halavy's opera Le Lazeron. Unfortunately, her performance was very disappointing and publicly mocked. One newspaper of the time wrote that her beauty gave her an initial advantage, but that she had no talent to go with it. In Paris, she attended many high society events, making friends and lovers in a variety of circles. She had affairs with Alexandre Dumas, the man responsible for the Count of Monte Cristo and the Three Musketeers. as well as Alexandre Duharrier, a drama critic and newspaper owner. It was thanks to these wealthy men that she took as lovers, which allowed her to maintain a great lifestyle and continue her career as a dancer. However, one night in 1845, after a night of drinking and gambling, one of her lovers got into a quarrel. The newspaper publisher Alexandre Duharrier was in attendance, and while intoxicated, offended Jean-Baptiste Rosamond de Beauvalon. Infuriated, he challenged the drunk Duharrier to a duel. Although Lola, who was skilled with a gun, offered to take his place, the newspaper publisher refused and accepted the duel, and as a result, ended up dying. After the trial, Lola pursued the composer Franz Liszt to Bonn. For a strange reason, she demanded entrance to a male-only banquet, and once inside, danced on a table, leaving everyone present shocked and perturbed. After this episode, she made her way to Munich and arrived in September 1846. While there, she caught the attention of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, who had a love for all things Spanish and female. There was a rumour that when they first met, the king asked her if her bosom was real, saying nature or art. She responded to the question by cutting open the front of her dress, revealing what nature had given her. It didn't take long for her to conquer the elderly king and become his mistress. Sources from the time tell us that she had a lot of control over the king and used her influence to support the liberal political and social causes, namely by limiting the power of the conservatives and the Catholic clergy. Her influence became so great that Ludwig dismissed Karl von Abbe, the leader of the Ministry of Interior, because he was against making Lola a countess. Ludwig was deeply in love with Lola, yet this bewitchment later led to his downfall. The government and local population noticed how Lola was controlling the king. They disliked this, her reformist attitude, arrogant manner, and her outbursts of temper. Her unpopularity rose when her petition to be made a noble was made public. Despite the resentment that existed in Bavaria in 1847, Ludwig went against public opinion and made her Countess of Landsfeld. As well as this, she was granted a large annual pension and a nice home. One general apparently said, "I've never seen such a demon," when referring to Lola. In 1848, riots broke out in Bavaria. Among the groups involved was a faction at the University of Munich that rose up against the king. Taking the advice of his mistress, he decided to close the whole university. Yet, by March the revolutionary movement had gained momentum, and he had no other option than to reopen the university. The power of the revolutionaries and the hostility towards Lola left him with no other option than to expel her from the country, and a few days later, abdicate the throne. Despite Ludwig's previous popularity, his relationship with Lola and the decisions he made under her influence played a large part in his demise. Lola then fled to Switzerland, where she hoped Ludwig would join her, but he never did. Then, in late 1848, she returned to England and quickly married George Trafford Heald, a young army cornet who had just so happened to come into an inheritance. However, the terms from her first divorce stated that no party could remarry if the other was still living. Because of this, she was arrested on a charge of bigamy, but released on bail. The newlyweds were forced to escape England. Initially, they lived in France, and later in Spain, but after just 2 years, the relationship grew sour. Then, one day, George Heald mysteriously disappeared. It's unclear what exactly happened to him, but it was reported that he drowned. Once again on her own, in 1851, Lola set off to make a new start in America. She hoped to reinvent herself as a performer. It was also around this time that she started carrying a whip with her more frequently, and also a pistol. Lola became involved in numerous assaults, scandals, and legal actions. Apparently, she used her whip to beat a man who had offended her. Although these rumours were probably based on truth, Lola denied these allegations, but she did say, "There is one comfort in all these falsehoods, which is that these men very likely would have deserved horsewhipping." In May 1853, she arrived on the west coast in San Francisco. It was here that she gave the first performances of her notorious spider dance. On the 1st of July, she took on a third marriage to Patrick Purdy Hall, owner of the San Francisco Wig. After a month, the couple moved to Grass Valley, California, but the marriage soon failed. He then sued for a divorce, naming a German doctor as co-respondent. A few days later, the doctor's corpse was found in some nearby hills, after having been shot dead. Lola remained in Grass Valley for nearly 2 years before sailing for Sydney, Australia. She arrived in Sydney on the 16th of August, 1855. Initially, she starred in a play called Lola Montez in Bavaria, which was based on part of her life. A few weeks later, while performing the same play at the Theatre Royal, Melbourne, she performed her erotic spider dance, raising her skirts so high that the audience could see. She wore no underclothing at all. This performance was seen by many as completely against public morality, and many even called for her to be arrested. After this, she continued to tour Australia with mixed success. Her infamy grew when she publicly horsewhipped Henry Seacamp, the editor of the Ballarat Times, because of a negative article published about her. In May 1856, Lola finished her tour and sailed with her manager Noel Folland back to San Francisco. However, one night he was lost overboard. The details remain unclear and no official investigation followed. Now back in the States, she had hoped to continue her career, but she had little success. Now in her mid-30s, she invented herself as a lecturer, speaking on her life and heroines of history. Moreover, she turned to religion and delivered a series of moral lectures in Britain and America. In 1859, she moved to New York and lived a quiet life until her death. One newspaper wrote that she doesn't have much to do with the world's people. Lola Montez died on the 7th of January 1861 due to complications caused by the tertiary stage of syphilis. She is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. We are staying in the 19th century for our last story, but are crossing the channel to France. The woman who would later become known as Marie Duplessis was actually born as Alphonsine Rose Plessis on the 15th of January 1824 in the village of Nonant-le-Pin in Normandy in northern France. Alphonsine was not born into wealth, far from it. Her background was one of extreme poverty and difficulty. Her father, Marine Plessis, was the illegitimate son of a prostitute and a priest. He was a man who had been brutalized by his life experiences and had developed a sinister bent himself. He was abusive to Alphonsine's mother Marie, and she eventually abandoned her family to seek out work as a maid elsewhere and to leave the abusive life she was living in. It is believed that she had intended to eventually send for her daughters to join her at some time in the future, but the plan never materialized, as Marie died when Alphonsine was just 6 years old. Alphonsine's childhood did not get any better. She was separated from her older sister shortly after their mother's death, when she was sent to live with an uncle. At this time, Alphonsine was sent to live on the farm of one of her mother's cousins. According to several of her biographies, Alphonsine was abused here by some of the farm workers, with this beginning from about the age of 11. Eventually, Alphonsine was rescued from this dire situation when she was sent back to her father, who had her apprenticed as a laundress, an occupation which involved tough physical work with a little financial reward, but which did lead her being removed from the torturous scenario on the farm. However, even this reprieve did not last for long, as Alphonsine's father abandoned her early in her teenage years and appears to have sold her to an elderly bachelor in Paris. She was now effectively on her own, but she showed her resourcefulness even at her young age by escaping from the aging bachelor and acquiring work as a maid in the French capital. For a time afterwards, she was apprenticed to a dressmaker, but it was in her late teens that she would begin to work as a courtesan, the profession which would result in acquiring a sort of literary fame in the mid-19th century. One day in 1839, Alphonsine Plessis, who by now was 15 years of age, was standing on a street in Paris, gazing longingly at a food stall which was selling dishes of fried potatoes. As she was there, one Louis Nestor Roqueplan, a well-regarded writer, journalist and theatre director in Paris at the time, passed by and spotted her. Understanding that the look on her face was born of hunger and deprivation, he approached the young woman and offered to buy her some food. Alphonsine thanked him and devoured the dish when presented to her. It was a chance meeting, but one which changed Alphonsine's life. Over the next several months, Alphonsine developed a relationship with Roqueplan, which saw her being introduced to many literary and artistic figures in Paris, and above all, men with money. By now, she was evidently emerging as an attractive young woman, and into the early 1840s, she entered into a string of relationships with wealthy individuals whom she met in Paris. The first of these was to Monsieur Nullet, an affluent restaurant owner in the city. Within a few weeks of meeting her, Nullet had rented an apartment for her in the city, on the Rue de l'Arcade, and gave her 3,000 francs to meet her material needs. It was the beginning of her new life as a courtesan, effectively a prostitute for wealthier clients. Soon, Alphonsine realized that there were wealthier clients out there than Monsieur Nullet, and she began to look elsewhere. It was also around this time that she adopted the name she is more well known by, Marie Duplessis. Marie was her mother's name, while Duplessis was a slightly altered version of her actual surname, Plessis. Alphonsine simply added a du to it, as it added an aristocratic slant to the surname. She also began to develop interests associated with the aristocracy. For instance, one of her lovers, a wealthy young man by the name of Agénor du Guiche, arranged for her to receive dance and piano lessons, and she also began to learn to read and write. Duplessis became the toast of many French parties in the French capital during the 1840s, famed for her wit and beauty, but to those who knew her well, there was also a contradictory sadness to her at times, a product, no doubt, of her traumatic childhood. Her awareness of how grim an existence a person could have could be seen in her charitable donations to foundations which helped abused women and abandoned girls in Paris, a situation which she had escaped not too long ago. Nullet and de Guiche were far from Duplessis' only lovers. Others included Edouard de Périgord, the romantic novelist Roger de Beauvoir, Count Gustav von Stackelberg, an elderly aristocrat from central Germany, and the Hungarian composer and pianist Franz Liszt. Liszt was probably the individual with whom Marie was associated, who she held the most affection towards, and if there was true love in her short life, it was most likely felt for him. However, Marie's love life is certainly most remembered today for her affair with Alexandre Dumas Jr., the son of Alexandre Dumas Sr., the acclaimed author of novels such as The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. The son also had literary ambitions, one which he would realize to some extent in later life, though he always lived in his father's shadow. In 1844, he was still a young man of 20 years of age when he first met Marie, who was the same age as he. They entered into a relationship within weeks, but Dumas, who was infatuated by Marie, was tormented by her ongoing relationships with several other men throughout the mid-1840s. Consequently, he attempted to distance himself from her in 1846 though she made it clear that she wished to continue their relationship, even if it would never be monogamous on her part. Marie eloped to London briefly in 1846, where she married one of her lovers, the French aristocrat Edouard de Périgord. However, she was also increasingly ill, even though she was only 22 years of age at the time. Marie was suffering from tuberculosis, a devastating wasting disease which had begun to become more and more virulent in the cramped urban squalor of industrial age Europe. What was worse, little was known about how tuberculosis was transmitted, how it impacted on its victims, or how to stop its ravages in the 19th century. Thus, within just a few short months of her marriage, Marie died in Paris on the 3rd of February 1847, aged just 23. Her husband and another one of her lovers, Count Gustav von Stackelberg, were at her bedside when she passed. Her funeral at Montmartre Cemetery in the north of Paris a few days later was attended by hundreds of people, many of them from Paris's artistic and literary world, a statement of how high she had managed to rise as a courtesan in the French capital in just a few short years. Marie was immortalized shortly after her death by Dumas in his most acclaimed work, entitled La Dame aux Camélias, The Lady of the Camellias, sometimes known simply as Camille. The novel was a thinly disguised biographical account of Marie's life, with the main character, Marguerite Gautier, effectively being Marie, and the main male character in the book, Armand Duval, being Dumas in all but name. The novel was remarkable at the time for its sympathetic portrait of a courtesan, and how her life was shaped in many ways by the circumstances of her early life and times, something which readers were unused to. It went on to become a bestseller in France during the second half of the 19th century. Dumas followed up the book in 1852 with a stage version of La Dame aux Camélias. It was banned at first by the Parisian stage censors, who were unwilling to accept its depiction of both prostitution and the wasting disease that was tuberculosis on stage. However, in light of Dumas' father's reputation, they soon came around and allowed the play to be performed. Yet, it was not so fortunate elsewhere, and the play was banned in London for many years to come. Dumas' work was not the only one which retold elements of Duplessis' story in the mid-19th century. Just a few years later, the famed Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi composed one of his most acclaimed operas, La Traviata, which told Marie's story. Verdi's opera was based on Dumas' play, as he had been visiting Paris early in 1852 when the play version of La Dame aux Camélias debuted on the stage of the French capital. Verdi was struck by the story and immediately began composing music for what would become an opera derived from Dumas' telling of Marie's story. The result, which was finalized in 1853, was La Traviata, which translates approximately as The Fallen Woman. It was first performed at La Fenice Opera House in Venice on the 6th of March 1853. The main character was called Violetta, but she was clearly based on Marie Duplessis, and her story ends exactly as Marie's life did, with her time as a prostitute and then her death from tuberculosis. Curiously enough, despite La Dame aux Camélias still being censored in Britain, La Traviata was performed in London within months of its premiere in northern Italy. The justification for this was that, while an English audience might be able to understand Duplessis' story when related in the French Dumas had used, it was believed that Verdi's opera would be unintelligible to an English audience where few spoke or understood Italian. La Traviata was noteworthy at the time for featuring the first character to die in an opera from tuberculosis. Also, its subject matter resonated with people, and Marie's story quickly became one of the most popular operas of the 19th century. It has remained one of Verdi's most acclaimed works in the century and a half since, and is still widely performed today. Thus, while many people are unaware of the fact, many people have seen the story of Marie Duplessis played out before them at the opera. Marie Duplessis is still fairly well remembered today, in large part owing to her associations with some of the most prominent literary and cultural figures of the mid-19th century. Several biographies of her have been published, while in her native Normandy, one can visit a museum dedicated specifically to her memory, the La Dame aux Camélias Museum, so named after Dumas' work. The role of Marguerite in La Dame aux Camélias or Camille became one of the most prized roles in the golden age of theatre in the late 19th century, and Marguerite's story has been retold in thousands of performances, from the stages of Paris to Broadway in New York down to the present day. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on these courtesan tales. I hope you found them interesting. Let me know what you thought of their lives down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.